Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to cut through decades of conventional wisdom and, frankly, a lot of urban myths surrounding one of the most complex areas of human behavior, nonverbal communication.
A huge topic.
It is. We're taking a deep look at a stack of sources covering, well, everything from high-stakes deception detection, what actually works versus what we think works, all the way to how the most advanced AI is learning to read your emotional leakage, maybe even better than you can.
And that's a critical subject because human behavior, especially when you're dealing with stress or emotion or deceit, it's just notoriously ambiguous.
Right.
For generations, we've relied on these cultural touchstones, the shifty eyes, the nervous fidget, as these infallible tells of a lie.
That's the stuff you see in movies.
Exactly. But systematic, rigorous research, really over the last couple of decades, tells us that these long-held beliefs are, well, they're largely unfounded. The cues we intuitively believe are the most reliable are often entirely invalid, and that leads to some pretty spectacular failures in human judgment.
Absolutely. So our deep dive is really structured to answer several core questions for you. First, why does human lie detection fail so spectacularly, even when it's practiced by supposed professionals?
They will.
Second, what is the handful of truly reliable cues that science is pointing toward now? And third, how are both specialized human interviewing techniques and, sophisticated, effective AI systems trying to finally master this subtle, elusive language?
And we're going to start right off the bat with, I think, a surprising conclusion that really upends much of what you've probably learned from popular culture.
Yeah.
That is, microexpressions, those rapid facial movements we hear so much about, are not the best way to catch a liar.
Not the best way.
Not when compared to other subtler nonverbal shifts. In fact, we'll introduce a powerful alternative, what's called the rigidity effect, and show how our sort of conventional reliance on nervous statistics led to massive institutional failures.
Okay, let's unpack this failure of human credibility judgment because the data really shows it's absolutely pervasive. Most people, whether you're a layperson judging a friend or a professional interviewing a suspect, are just highly prone to error.
They are.
When we talk about how weak these signs are that we're looking for, what does the definitive research actually say?
The sources are, they're overwhelming on this point. The signs we look for are incredibly faint, often just too subtle to be reliable. One of the most critical pieces of evidence comes from a comprehensive meta-analysis, so that's a study of studies, that looked at an astonishing 338 estimates of 158 different behaviors.
Wow, that is a huge sample size.
The sheer scale of it lets us speak with a lot of confidence. And what it concluded was that very few behaviors are systematically related to deception. And critically, those few that are related are only very weakly connected to actual deceit.
So the signal is just incredibly noisy.
Incredibly. The main takeaway for you as a learner is this. People fail to detect deception, primarily because the behavioral signs that indicate lying are so faint they're almost non-existent, even when you measure them precisely.
And that's a fundamental challenge. The problem is compounded because both everyday people and those we categorize as lie experts, customs agents, police interrogators, they consistently report relying on cues that this same body of research proves are entirely invalid.
Right.
What are some of those notorious false tells that just everyone seems to believe in?
The list is unfortunately pretty long, but the sources are clear on the top offenders. The invalidated cues that people report using include the infamous gaze aversion.
The idea that a liar won't look you in the eye.
That's the one. Also high on the list are fidgeting, various speech errors like stuttering or slips of the tongue, the presence of long pauses, and, dramatic posture shifts.
But those cues, they don't sound like signs of deceit. They sound like classic signs of just generalized nervousness or stress.
Exactly. That is the key insight. The scientific literature confirms that these behaviors, gaze aversion, fidgeting, speech errors, they are fundamentally cues to general stress, to nervousness, or to discomfort. They are not systematically related to deception itself.
So you could be nervous because you're lying.
Or you can be nervous because you're innocent, but you're afraid of being falsely accused by an authority figure.
Well,
and they look the same.
You can't reliably distinguish the two based on those cues alone.
You can't. In fact, some studies show that having access only to nonverbal cues can actually impair lie detection accuracy.
Really? How?
Because it distracts the observer from the verbal content, which is often where the real clues are.
That inability to distinguish fear of being caught from fear of being wrongly accused, that is precisely where institutional failure takes root. And this brings us to a really compelling and frankly disturbing institutional failure example, the TSA's SPOT program.
Right, the Screening of Passengers by Observation Techniques program. This was a massive multi-million-dollar undertaking designed entirely on the premise of observing nonverbal and facial cues to detect malicious intent among travelers.
But the sources reveal a pretty shocking contradiction, don't they? The academic literature that was in the TSA's own files undercut the entire premise of their own program.
It did. The agency knew, based on the research they already had, that behavioral signs of deception were weak or non-existent, and that human screeners are, well, generally unskilled at telling truth from deception.
And the sheer cognitive load of trying to do that.
It's immense. The idea of making accurate, rapid judgments based on such weak cues meant the system was likely doomed from the start.
So when the program was critically evaluated, how rigorous was that initial attempt to, validate it?
Well, not very.
Yeah.
According to external reviews, this is a critical point about research integrity. A 2014 Government Accountability Office, or GAO, report concluded that a 2011 study the TSA commissioned to validate SPOT had a fatally flawed methodology and used unreliable data.
So the whole thing was questionable from the get-go.
The issues were numerous, from how the data was collected to how behaviors were categorized. It just rendered the study's conclusions completely questionable. The program simply lacked robust scientific validation, which stands in stark contrast to its wide-scale, very expensive implementation.
So it seems then that without clear, reliable cues, systems designed to catch liars are just. They're set up to fail. And it leads observers to fall back on their own assumptions.
It does.
And we see a really disturbing outcome of that institutional failure in the sources, specifically about profiling instances and biases that were sort of institutionalized in the training materials themselves.
Right. And this is a complex issue we have to report on impartially, focusing on what the training materials and the sources actually contained. Documents showed that certain materials, specifically these things called profile pretests, had information that was highly selective and factually incorrect. For example, some questions falsely imply that only male Muslim extremists were responsible for specific historic terrorist attacks, like the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, when his assassin was not Muslim. So these materials appeared to conflate Muslims and terrorists.
And the practical application of this kind of bias led to really granular physical descriptions of how to profile people based on appearance, right? Which goes way beyond observing neutral nonverbal cues.
Precisely. One section suggested profiling based on race, religion, and appearance. For instance, the training told screeners to watch for a male with a fresh shave and lighter skin on his lower face, suggesting this may be a religious Muslim zealot who has just shaved his beard so as not to attract attention.
Wow.
Another line questioned if an individual was wearing too much cologne or perfume, or if they smelled of talcum powder or scented water, which it noted was for ritual purification. The implication was clear. The actual behavioral cues were weak, so screeners were substituting cultural, racial, and religious stereotypes for genuine indicators.
And we know from the documents that this wasn't just in the training materials. Supervisors were caught engaging in prohibited activities, right? Making referrals based on profiling of passengers based on appearance or race, without the required suspicious behaviors actually being present.
That's right. And we also saw these deeply problematic presentations that analyzed female suicide bombers, titled Femme Fatale.
I remember reading that.
It focused heavily on stereotyping their motivations based on deeply personal and, potentially factually incorrect details like their attractiveness, marital status, or sexual history. It went as far as describing one as a barren divorcee and an outcast.
So this is a stark illustration of what you mentioned earlier, the Brokaw hazard.
Exactly. When the objective scientific cues are weak or invalid, the human observer inevitably falls back on their own conscious or unconscious bias. They start conflating general stress or appearance or stereotypes with actual malicious intent.
Okay, so let's pivot away from those invalidated cues. If the twitching and the eye darting are unreliable, what is the scientific community moving toward as a more reliable indicator of high-stakes, spontaneous deception?
So we shift our focus now to an alternative hypothesis known as the rigidity effect, or RE.
The rigidity effect.
This is theorized to happen when a person is engaged in extemporaneous deception.
Yep.
So, unplanned, on the spot, lying under circumstances with very high stakes. And it triggers this profound initial freeze response.
A freeze response. So wait, instead of fidgeting more, they actually stop moving entirely for a moment?
That is the core hypothesis. This inhibition of movement, this temporary rigidity, is theorized as an adaptive response that's consistent with what's known as interpersonal deception theory, or IDT.
Okay, we should probably spend a moment on IDT to understand the mechanism here.
For sure. IDT posits that deceivers are simultaneously trying to manage two types of behavior, strategic and non-strategic.
What's the difference between those?
Okay, so strategic communication is the deliberate effort to appear credible. That's, maintaining eye contact. Ironically, the opposite of the old controlling your speech rate, managing the overall story,
The conscious part.
the conscious part. Non-strategic behavior is the involuntary leakage, the physiological or emotional cues that slip out despite the deceiver's best efforts.
Got it. So how does the rigidity effect fit into that framework?
The sources suggest that lying, especially unplanned lying, requires an immense cognitive load,
You're juggling a lot.
a ton. You're constructing a false narrative, making sure it's internally consistent, monitoring the other person's reaction, and trying to suppress any leakage of emotion or nervousness. The freeze response, the rigidity, is the body's ultimate, albeit temporary, non-strategic control mechanism.
It's like an instinctive full-body inhibition.
Exactly. It's an attempt to prevent any movement or leakage until the conscious mind can process what to do next.
That makes perfect sense. The system is so overloaded by the conflict between strategic control and non-strategic leakage that it hits the pause button. It's that moment before the deceiver can decide whether to lean forward or retreat, whether to smile or frown.
Precisely. And the research suggests this initial inhibition is temporary. It lasts just long enough for the deceiver to decide on their next move. But what's truly fascinating is what moderates this. The degree of this behavioral inhibition, this rigidity, is hypothesized to be positively related to both emotional distress and the severity of the stakes involved.
So you're saying the more a person has to lose, the more likely they are to just freeze up.
Absolutely. We're talking about consequences like imminent physical pain, significant financial loss, or the threat of imprisonment. If you're lying about a small matter, you might fidget. If you're lying about massive corporate fraud, that freeze is much more likely to appear.
And it's inversely related to planning, you said.
Right. It's inversely related to the opportunity the deceiver has had for planning and adapting their responses. If the lie is spontaneous, the cognitive load is enormous, and that freeze is more likely to appear than the common invalidated cues like fidgeting. The rigidity effect really shifts the focus from looking for chaotic movement to looking for the absence of movement.
All right, now we need to move from those large-scale body movements, or the lack of them, down to the absolute micro level, the face. If we want objective measurement, we have to talk about the system that serves as the gold standard across psychology, neuroscience, and increasingly, artificial intelligence. I'm talking about the facial action coding system, or FACS.
FACS. Originally developed by psychologists Paul Ekman and Wallace Friesen, it is indeed the most acknowledged, credible, and comprehensive system for objectively measuring visually discernible facial movements.
And it's critical to understand this isn't about subjectively judging emotion. It's based on facial anatomy, right?
That's the crucial distinction. The system isn't reading emotions directly, it's reading muscles and musculature changes. It's almost forensic in its precision.
So how does it work?
FACS breaks down every possible independent facial movement into specific measurable units called action units, or AUS. Each AU corresponds to the contraction or relaxation of one or a small group of underlying facial muscles.
Can you give an example?
Sure. The specific muscle that crinkles the outer corner of your eye, that's AU6. When you raise the outer corners of your eyebrows in confusion or sadness, that's AU1 and AU4 working together. Coders use frame-by-frame video analysis to meticulously score the occurrence, the duration, and the intensity of these AUs.
Given the sheer number of muscles in the face and all the ways they can combine, how complex does this system actually get in practice?
Oh, it's immensely complex. While there are a finite number of individual action units, around 44 standard ones and 14 supplementary ones, researchers have observed over 7,000 distinct AU combinations that the human face is capable of producing.
7,000.
Yep. It just demonstrates the incredible subtlety and complexity of facial displays when we're expressing emotion or trying to conceal it. FACS acts as the foundation, the objective anatomical language for all modern emotion recognition.
And this objective coding brings us directly to the concept that has gained the most cultural attention when it comes to deception, the microexpression. We hear about them constantly in popular media, usually framed as the ultimate, undeniable tell. What exactly defines a microexpression in the scientific context? Why are they so significant?
So a microexpression, or ME, is defined as a rapid, involuntary facial expression that reveals a genuine, concealed emotion. This phenomenon is often called emotional leakage.
And the key word there is involuntary.
It is.
Yeah.
That's why they're so significant. They are produced by the exact same neural mechanisms that produce our controlled, longer, or macro expressions. The only difference is temporal. It's a failure of suppression. The real emotion just leaks out for a fraction of a second.
And that duration is the source of a lot of ongoing scientific debate. I mean, if I asked 10 people, I'd probably get 10 different definitions of how short a microexpression is.
You would. There is a notorious lack of consensus on the precise duration. Early estimates cited a very fast range, from 125th to 15th of a second. More recent publications have broadened that, often defining them simply as lasting less than half a second, so 500 milliseconds.
That ambiguity must make training difficult.
It does. But research has tried to find a precise, practical boundary, a critical turning point for reliable recognition by a human observer. And those studies found something really interesting.
What was that?
They pointed to a very specific timeline. 200 milliseconds, or 15th of a second, appears to be a critical turning point. Below that threshold, it is extremely difficult for untrained participants to distinguish the expression from just, noise.
But beyond 200 milliseconds?
Beyond 200 meters, the recognition accuracy levels off. It suggests that duration matters immensely for these fleeting signals. It also suggests that with intensive, targeted training, people can learn to accurately identify expressions that last as briefly as 40 milliseconds. But that 200 meters mark essentially separates the realm of the extremely difficult to detect leakage from the longer, more noticeable flash of emotion.
Okay, so let's look at what these microexpressions actually look like. Let's focus on the 6 universal basic emotions that are studied as defined by their action units.
We can break them down anatomically. For happiness, which is the easiest to recognize because it rarely gets confused with other states, you look for 2 primary AUs in conjunction. First, the upturned corners of the mouth, that's AU12.
The classic smile muscle.
Right, the zygomatic major muscle. And critically, the crow's feet around the eyes, which is AU6, the orbicularis oculi. A genuine or Duchenne smile involves both. If only the mouth is smiling, it's more likely to be a social mask.
Okay, and for the more negative or highly energized emotions like anger and fear, what are the key defining indicators?
Anger is signaled primarily by the lowering and furrowing of the brows. That's AU4, often combined with tightening of the lips, AU23, or complete lip compression, AU24. A classic sign is a fixed, intense gaze.
And fear.
Fear is neurologically complex because it's a high arousal negative state. You typically see wide eyes, that's AU5 raised eyebrows, which are AUS1 and 2, and the lips are stretched horizontally, known as AU20. That horizontal lip stretch is a classic telltale indicator of fear. You rarely see it in other emotional states.
What about the lower arousal states, like sadness and disgust?
For sadness, you have the classic downturned mouth corners, AU15, and typically drooping eyelids, sometimes combined with the inner brow actions, AUS1 and 4, which pull the inner corners of the brows up toward the forehead.
And disgust.
Disgust is an emotion of aversion, so you see a wrinkled nose and a raised upper lip, that's AU9. The face is basically recoiling from something offensive. And finally, surprise, the reaction to shock is distinct because the components are always raised eyebrows, opened eyes, and a dropped jaw.
Okay, this is where we integrate this precise analysis back into the real world of high-stakes deception detection. And we have that crucial case study from the FBI on analytical interviewing that really demonstrates the utility of spotting this leakage.
Right. This is a perfect illustration of how specialized training applying these FACS principles translates into actionable intelligence. Analytical interviewing is designed to look for behavioral anomalies.
So nonverbal signs that contradict the verbal message a suspect is delivering.
Exactly. Let's focus on Mary, the suspect who was accused of assault.
Right.
Mary, a 42-year-old female, was denying any knowledge of the crime. Verbally, she was claiming innocence, smiling, leaning forward, sounding vulnerable, all strategic attempts to appear credible. This aligns perfectly with that IDT's strategic behavior.
But the experienced investigator was looking for the non-strategic leakage.
He was. And he noted 2 distinct microexpressions of disgust, that's AU9, the wrinkled nose, when she was verbally professing her innocence.
Disgust. That's a powerful emotional leakage. I mean, why would a genuinely innocent person leak disgust in that moment?
It's an anomaly. Disgust often indicates distaste or moral aversion. It could be directed at the interviewer, the situation, or potentially at her own deceptive actions. But the true pivot point came later.
What happened?
When the investigator stated the allegation directly, her eyes instantly widened AU5, a clear, involuntary indicator of concealed fear. The expression was fleeting, a microexpression of fear, which meant it was suppressed almost instantly.
And the investigator interpreted this rapid fear as definitive leakage of guilt.
Correct. The investigator interpreted the sequence, the initial disguise of innocence combined with the leakage of disgust, followed by that involuntary suppressed fear when confronted with the reality of the accusation, as the fear of a guilty person being caught.
As opposed to the general distress of an innocent person.
Exactly, which might show up as sadness or prolonged stress, but perhaps not that immediate involuntary fear response.
Mm.
And that small involuntary piece of leakage was enough to guide the entire interview.
It let him pivot the whole line of questioning.
It did, away from general denial toward meaningful content, pressing the psychological weak points indicated by the leakage, which ultimately resulted in an inadvertent confession. It's a powerful case study, but it only works when applied by a highly trained individual.
And yet, this high-stakes environment is just rife with hazards. This requires us to revisit the potential for error, even for trained observers. We have to clearly define the two critical errors here.
Absolutely. The first is the Othello error. This happens when an observer misinterprets genuine fear or distress as the fear of being caught in a lie.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Imagine an innocent, socially awkward person being interviewed by police. They're terrified of the authority figure and the possibility of being wrongly imprisoned. Their face and body leak fear. If the investigator sees this fear and automatically jumps to the conclusion of guilt, they have committed the Othello error. They've misattributed the source of that high arousal emotion.
So the emotion is real, but the observer assumes the wrong cause.
Exactly. The second error connects directly back to our first section on invalidated cues. That's the Brokaw hazard.
Okay.
This is the error of relying on cues that only indicate general stress or discomfort, like that incessant fidgeting or gaze aversion we talked about, and misinterpreting those cues as deception itself.
So if the Othello error is misattributing the cause of a genuine emotion like fear, the Brokaw hazard is relying on a cue that isn't indicative of any specific internal state beyond just general stress.
That is the perfect distinction. To effectively detect deception, you have to avoid both pitfalls. The Othello error warns you not to assume guilt from genuine fear, and the Brokaw hazard warns you not to use scientifically invalidated cues to jump to a conclusion about deceit. Mastering these hazards is as important as mastering the AUs themselves.
We've spent the first half of this deep dive really looking outward, focusing on how we detect deceit and subtle leakage in others. But often the person we're least aware of, the source of our own leakage, is ourselves. And this is where the tools used to detect deceit can actually be flipped inward to dramatically increase self-awareness and emotional intelligence, which, ironically, can make you a better interviewer or observer.
And self-awareness is not just some soft skill. It is the absolute foundation of emotional intelligence and authentic change. It's the capacity to perceive your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors as they arise in real time, and then consciously guide them.
Right.
The psychologist Daniel Goleman suggests that people with a solid sense of self-awareness have more self-confidence and a more realistic, grounded self-assessment because they're constantly getting reliable feedback from their own internal system.
But if someone is struggling with self-awareness, why do so many conventional attempts at self-improvement seem to fail? You know, they read the books, they go to therapy, but they don't seem to make significant progress.
Oh, our sources suggest that many attempts fail because they're too heavily focused on the neocortex, our thoughts, our beliefs, our narratives,
Yeah.
the conscious mental processes,
The thinking brain.
the thinking brain. If your underlying emotional state is driven by something unconscious, just changing your conscious beliefs often won't hold. To make significant progress and become more conscious of what's actually driving your behavior, you have to address what is currently unconscious. And this often involves trauma or stagnation or suppressed emotions that are stored physically in the body.
So if you're cut off from feeling your body clearly, like you don't feel the tightness in your chest before the anxiety hits, you can't get the internal feedback you need.
Exactly. The body holds the score, so to speak. And we need body-first modalities to unlock that suppressed awareness, much like the body involuntarily leaks rigidity or microexpressions.
So what does that look like in practice? What are some of these modalities?
The sources mention a few that are part of this integrated approach: body, heart, and mind. Trauma release exercises, or TRE, use deep stretches to produce spontaneous therapeutic shaking that helps the body process and release stored tension. There's also bioenergetic analysis, a somatic therapy that links character structure to muscular tension. And even certain forms of psychedelic psychotherapy are cited, which aim to temporarily dissolve the rigidity of the self to access deeper emotional content, citing pioneering research from psychiatrists like Stanislav Grof. These methods all start with the physical, instinctive responses, forcing the emotional system to communicate with the conscious mind.
Okay, let's make this actionable for the listener. What exercises can we integrate into a daily routine to build this foundation of self-awareness?
We've got several techniques from the sources that are low barrier and high impact. The first is the 30-second body language check-in.
Okay.
Multiple times a day, just pause and quickly notice. Where are you holding tension? Is it your shoulders, your jaw, your stomach? What is your posture communicating right now? Are you protective, open, collapsed? And how is your breathing? Is it shallow or deep? This simple, frequent act transforms these abstract emotions into tangible physical sensations, building awareness over time.
And given our focus on the face and FACS, the mirror technique seems invaluable for connecting our internal states to our external cues.
Absolutely. Set aside 60 seconds in front of a mirror and just observe your facial shifts while thinking about different scenarios. Imagine a stressful meeting, then think of a happy memory, then recall an injustice. This trains you to recognize the subtle facial cues, the onset of those AUS, that indicate emotional changes before they become overwhelming. You're literally watching your own expressions form.
Beyond the body, we also need to address our internal dialogue and how we assess ourselves more holistically.
Right. Monitoring the inner voice is key. The language we use every day profoundly shapes our relationship with ourselves and with others. If you catch yourself using aggressive or derogatory language internally, you have to consciously shift that lexicon. The other tool for a broader assessment is the Wheel of Life.
The visual tool for assessing satisfaction, how does that help with emotional intelligence?
It gives you a necessary, structured overview. You assess your current satisfaction on a 1 to 10 scale across 8 critical categories: career, money, health, friends and family, significant other, personal growth, fun and recreation, and physical environment.
So you can see where you're out of balance.
Exactly. By charting where you are deficient, you identify forgotten or hidden areas of who you are. It forces you out of that single narrative, I am just stressed about work, and into a much more complex and honest self-assessment.
Now, moving from self-awareness to social awareness, how can we translate this knowledge into developing empathy and better communication, say, in the workplace?
We can use structured empathy-building activities.
Hmm.
The first, which is perfect for beginners, is emotion scanning. During conversations, instead of just focusing on the content, take quick mental notes of your own emotions and others' likely emotions based on their tone, their pace, or their expression.
So you're building your emotional vocabulary and recognition skills in real time.
You are, without disrupting the flow of the conversation. It's much like that FBI interviewer was trained to scan Mary's face without interrupting her narrative.
And expanding that vocabulary is so critical, given that most of us just default to 3 generic terms: fine, stressed, or tired.
That leads directly to the emotion wheel dialogue. You can use an emotion wheel, which offers dozens of nuanced feelings clustered around the core emotions, to expand your vocabulary beyond those defaults. Challenge yourself to use new, richer emotion terms in meetings.
And for dealing with past issues or conflict, there's that activity: rewrite the conflict.
That's a powerful 35 to 40-minute activity for groups. Participants privately jot down a brief past conflict, write the original script of what was said, and then rewrite the scene. In the new version, they consciously add empathetic statements, reflective listening, and genuinely curious questions.
And what does that do?
Discussing what shifts in tone or outcome occurs highlights the profound impact of empathetic intervention. It shows that the conflict often isn't about the topic, but about the feeling of being unheard.
Which leads us to the ultimate test of active listening: the empathy circle.
Right, this is a structured format, about 40 to 45 minutes, that requires intense focus. One person speaks for 4 minutes, and the second person, the reflector, has to mirror back the essence of what was said, both the content and the feeling. The speaker then confirms or corrects the reflection.
And the reflector can't inject their own opinions or advice.
None. The whole goal is to reinforce the feeling of being truly heard. It builds active listening skills that are crucial in all forms of communication.
Before we transition to AI, let's revisit self-awareness itself. There's a fascinating study on the dual awareness mechanism for our own faces, suggesting we perceive our own expressions differently depending on how we see them.
This is a critical neurological nuance. Studies showed that when people view their own facial expressions in real time, so looking in a mirror while experiencing the emotion, only the intensity of the expression was a significant predictor of self-awareness.
You have to be feeling it really strongly for it to register.
Essentially, yes. It has to break through your conscious focus and register spontaneously. But when people engaged in video review watching, a recording of themselves displaying the emotion, both intensity and duration were significant predictors of self-awareness.
So something changes when we look back at ourselves.
It suggests there are different neurological mechanisms at play. Experiencing it relies on raw, immediate intensity. But retrospectively analyzing it allows the brain to process the temporal element, the duration, integrating it with the memory of the feeling. The video review is basically training your conscious mind to be as meticulous as FACS coding, leading to greater long-term self-awareness.
All right, so if humans struggle with detecting these faint, low-duration cues in real time, and we're often relying on faulty metrics and falling prey to the Othello and Brocaw hazards, the natural technological progression is to turn to machines. And this brings us to the future of emotional analysis, affective computing.
The AI that reads your face and your state of arousal.
Exactly.
Affective computing is this emerging multidisciplinary field dedicated to making machines emotionally intelligent. It combines AI, signal processing, and wearable tech to recognize, interpret, and respond to human emotions.
And the goal here is pretty ambitious.
It is. It's to reduce the emotional disconnect between humans and technology, creating more intuitive, human-centered systems by making the machine responsive to our state of mind.
And this isn't just about reading a single facial expression like an old-school webcam filter. These systems are inherently multimodal, right? They're pulling data from various simultaneous vectors to get a holistic view of the user's state.
That's right. They triangulate data primarily from three vectors. First, there's the obvious one, facial expression recognition, SER, using high-resolution video, essentially running a digital automated FACS analysis in real time.
Okay.
Second, speech emotion recognition, SER, which analyzes vocal parameters and prosodic features, the non-content aspects of your speech like pitch variability, loudness, and speech rate.
And the SER systems are already outperforming average human ability, aren't they?
Significantly. The research shows speech analysis systems achieve recognition accuracy in the 70 to 80% range for basic emotional states. That substantially outperforms average human accuracy, which typically hovers around 60%.
Because humans get too caught up in the words being said.
Right. AI can isolate the tone, the rhythm, the volume, which are often better leakage points for emotion.
And they go deeper than just audio and video, tapping into our biology through physiological data.
Yes, through specialized wearables and sensors. They collect physiological data that measures sympathetic nervous system arousal. This includes galvanic skin response, GSR, also known as electrodermal activity, which measures the skin's electrical properties changing due to tiny amounts of sweat.
So the more aroused or stressed you are, the greater the skin conductance.
Whether from excitement or fear, yes. They also monitor blood volume pulse, BVP. This measures blood flow changes, allowing the system to detect things like a sudden heart jump that occurs when a subject experiences high arousal emotions like fear or surprise.
It's genuinely incredible that AI can read our biological stress response faster and more accurately than we can read each other, or maybe even ourselves. Let's look at a powerful application: mental disorder detection.
AI is being leveraged with remarkable results here to identify visual cues associated with mental disorders, specifically anxiety and depressive disorders. The systems look for persistent changes in a person's facial expression baseline, the frequency of certain AUS, like those sadness AUS 1 and 4, and overall facial rigidity or lack of movement.
And how are these models achieving such high accuracy? They're using really complex, innovative architectures.
They utilize sophisticated ensemble deep models, which are hybrid models integrating two major types of AI architecture: convolutional neural networks, or CNNs, and vision transformers, VIT.
Okay, we should unpack that difference a little.
Sure. CNNs are exceptional at detecting local features, like recognizing the texture of skin or spotting a small eye twitch. Vision transformers, on the other hand, are designed to process the image globally, analyzing the contextual relationship between different facial regions over time.
So a CNN might see the specific downturned mouth corner, but a VIT might process the overall rigidity of the face over a 30-second window, connecting that lack of movement to the overall context.
Exactly. By combining them, the hybrid model achieves far greater predictive accuracy. Using just facial cues, these models have reached an accuracy of around 81% in predicting the presence of a disorder.
That's amazing. But it also underscores a limitation, doesn't it? Relying exclusively on facial cues.
It does. Current models do primarily rely on facial cues alone. Future work has to integrate multimodal data, verbal communication, emotions over time, contextual information to fortify their robustness and ensure they aren't misdiagnosing, say, cultural norms or just idiosyncratic facial habits as signs of a disorder.
And given that this is healthcare, trust and transparency are paramount, how do they make sure a clinician or a user actually trusts these high-stakes predictions?
Transparency is provided through what's called explainable AI or XAI techniques. Methods like GradCam and saliency maps are incorporated to highlight the specific facial regions that influence the model's prediction.
So you can see the AI's thinking.
You can. If the model predicts depression, the XAI layer might highlight the inner brow region and the mouth corners as the primary influencers. This lets healthcare professionals see why the AI made a diagnosis, facilitating a more informed process and, crucially, building clinical trust in what would otherwise feel like a mysterious black box.
Now let's explore the commercial frontier. The use of these emotional cues in digital interactions, specifically with digital humans or embodied conversational agents, ECAs.
Right. These are becoming ubiquitous in customer service, education, e-commerce.
Everywhere.
They are, and researchers are applying microexpression science to them, studying how implementing subtle MEs affects our perception of these agents. The goal is technical empathy, to help these digital entities bridge the uncanny valley.
That psychological gap where something looks almost human but just feels eerie or wrong.
Exactly. So what if the perception findings shown about these engineered microexpressions? Which emotions work best? Generally, positive expressions like happiness are perceived as more trustworthy, but only up to a point. Researchers studied happiness and anger microexpressions at both normal or subtle levels and extreme intensity levels. They found that subtle, normal microexpressions of happiness help decrease feelings of eeriness and significantly increase perceived sincerity and trustworthiness.
So that intentional subtlety is what helps them cross the uncanny valley.
It makes the interaction feel natural and non-threatening.
So we prefer our digital assistants to be subtly happy, but an extreme emotional display, even a positive one, can backfire.
That is the essential nuance. Extreme happiness microexpressions were certainly noticeable, and they rated high for effect. The emotion came across strongly, but they can actually contribute to feelings of eeriness because the intensity feels manufactured or out of sync.
And the negative emotion.
Even more telling, extreme anger microexpressions got the lowest effect rating overall. Humans found high-intensity digital anger highly unpleasant.
And what happens if the digital microexpression contradicts the verbal message? Which is, the definition of human deception.
That is the technological uncanny valley trigger. Negative microexpressions, especially those that contradict the verbal context, like an agent showing a subtle angry microexpression while saying, "I'd be happy to help," tend to trigger strong feelings of eeriness. The contradiction suggests a misalignment, maybe even dishonesty, which users instinctively interpret as unnatural. The AI has to manage its strategic and non-strategic behavior just like a human deceiver does.
And these microexpressions, even when they're digitally implemented, they impact real-world decision-making.
Absolutely. The research specifically found that implementing these carefully controlled microexpressions into digital agents was shown to impact decision-making. Notably, participants who interacted with agents displaying subtle positive MEs reported a higher intention to hire that agent for a given task.
So subtlety, positivity, and congruence are everything.
They're paramount for effective digital human design and building trust.
Wow. This deep dive has taken us on quite a journey. From the documented failure of relying on common nervous cues like gaze aversion and fidgeting, which led us to those unfortunate institutional failures exposed in programs like the TSA's SBOT.
And we saw that the true indicator of high-stakes spontaneous lying might be the very lack of movement, introducing that counterintuitive rigidity effect.
Right. Then we moved from that new theory to the precise microscopic world of the facial action coding system, understanding how action units are the objective anatomical language of the face, and how microexpressions, despite being fleeting, provide that crucial leakage.
And then we applied this emotional knowledge inward, using self-awareness exercises from the 30-second body check-in to the empathy circle to better integrate the body, heart, and mind for greater emotional intelligence and to avoid the pitfalls of those Othello and Broca hazards.
And finally, we looked forward to the immense promise and subtle peril of effective computing. We saw how AI is already achieving high accuracy in recognizing multimodal emotional signals, being deployed in complex areas like mental health diagnosis, and strategically used in digital humans to reduce eeriness and increase trust by perfecting emotional display.
It's fascinating. We started by looking outward to detect lies, only to discover the weakness of our own perception. We ended up looking inward for self-awareness, and then forward to an AI that is mastering our nonverbal cues faster and more accurately than we can possibly hope to.
So what does this all mean? What's the final powerful takeaway we should leave with you, the learner?
I think it's this. The most reliable data about an individual's internal state, whether they are lying, deeply distressed, or simply unaware of their own feelings, often lies in the transient, involuntary movements they attempt to suppress. These suppressed cues, like the initial behavioral inhibition in the rigidity effect or the involuntary leakage of a 200 millisecond microexpression, are the hardest for the conscious mind to manage because they bypass strategic control.
But ironically,
Ironically, these are the easiest cues for meticulous AI systems to detect, given their computational capacity to process real-time, multimodal data that no human could ever track simultaneously.
yeah,
Our emotional defenses are failing, not because the machine is becoming human, but because the machine is becoming a better observer of the physical self.
that is a profound tension between our conscious control and our involuntary leakage. Which leads us to our final provocative thought for you to mull over. If AI systems are increasingly being used to analyze your involuntary facial cues and physiological data to assess your trustworthiness, your mental state, and your intent, does the rise of effective computing signal an end to truly private, unobserved emotion?